Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alana Hackshaw, and I'm an associate clinical professor and chief diversity and inclusion officer here at the School of Public Policy. And we are delighted to have you join us today, and we welcome you to the School of Public Policy's Race, Equity, and Public Policy Speaker Series. The School of Public Policy has developed this speaker series to strengthen our community's knowledge and understanding about the diverse aspects and contexts of race, racism, and inequality, and how they shape, create, and define important problems of policy, institutional responses, as well as economic, political, and social trends and outcomes. Additionally, another goal of the speaker series is to encourage all of us to consider how questions of policy about the role of race and racism are debated and critiqued as well. In line with these goals, we have invited an array of talented scholars from diverse disciplinary perspectives to share their research with us. Today, we are joined by Dr. Lallen T. Johnson, an associate professor in the Department of Justice, Law, and Criminology at American University. We are delighted to have him here today and happy that you are here with us as well. I'm now going to turn it over to Dr. Jennifer Littlefield, our Director of Undergraduate Studies, to introduce our guest speaker.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Okay. I'm letting folks in as I introduce. Okay, thank you so much. We are indeed delighted and so excited to have Dr. Johnson with us here today, and his really deep understanding and background around issues of crime and justice. He studies crime and justice outcomes, how they vary across urban space. He's concerned with how social structure and institutional processes facilitate the occurrence of violence within neighborhoods, which is extremely policy relevant for us. And also looking at the spatial concentration of violence across neighborhoods, which is a fascinating take on it as well. He looks at how his current project's looking at gentrification, how it shapes the nature and intensity of formal social control within mass transit systems. Also a fascinating topic that we don't talk a lot about within our school. I'd love to hear more about. He has many different studies funded in many different ways. He's been funded by the National Institute of Justice. He's been in a variety of different outlets, which is, I think, a terrific addition as well, looking at race and justice, punishment and society, health and place, urban affairs review. He covers all types of different fields of public policy, which is one of the reasons why we had such a stimulating conversation at the start of this, because he touches so many different pieces. And as we know, the issue of criminal justice and our urban spaces are wicked problems. So it takes all of these different perspectives to solve some of these challenges. So his deep knowledge and background in criminal justice and urban affairs means he has been a long list of invited presentations. He has a deep background in teaching and research. He's a faculty fellow in the Metropolitan Policy Center at American University, and also a faculty affiliate at the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center in American, which is a very intriguing group as well. So we're very excited to hear from him today on this extremely timely topic, the interaction effects of race and age composition on COVID-19 mortality across Chicago zip codes. So I will turn it over to you, Dr. Johnson.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I actually feel like someone that's done something over the past few years. I really appreciate that. I'm just going to start off by sharing my screen. I prepared a little bit of a presentation for us today. And so just a little bit of background about myself. Actually, first, I really want to thank the School of Public Policy for giving me the opportunity to share my work. So I'm an interdisciplinary scholar. I'm formally trained in criminal justice and urban studies and planning. To put it simply, I am a scholar of race that likes to examine racial impacts through the lenses of inequality and space. And some of my earlier research looked at the ways by which structural disadvantage, particularly in predominantly African-American communities, impacts violence across those neighborhoods as well. And so my research found that, many predominantly Black urban communities experience high levels of structural disadvantage, but the story really doesn't end there. Many predominantly Black communities in cities such as DC, Philadelphia, Baltimore, they're not only structurally disadvantaged, but they're situated nearby and surrounded by often other communities that are also highly disadvantaged. And that really amplifies the experiences with violence that take place in those communities, right? As a result, many of the institutions that would sort of buffer against violence, such as quality schools and other institutions as well, are largely absent, not only within communities, but across communities. And this makes violence for particularly predominantly Black communities all the more consequential. And so in growing this work, I began to think a little bit more about the ways by which racial identity and place sort of intersect to shape the experiences with social control that predominantly Black individuals, predominantly Black populations experience, right? So individually and across those communities. And so in this study, one of the things that I wanted to do was examine whether race is predictive of the level of punishment that a person would experience for engaging in fare evasion. And in this study, we defined fare evasion as either boarding a transit vehicle or attempting to board a transit vehicle without being able to provide valid proof of fare payment. And so once again, we wanted to determine if race and place sort of structures the extent of punishment that a person would receive for engaging in fare evasion. And so if an officer encounters a person that's engaging in fare evasion aboard the metro system here in DC, they have a number of options. They can, one, do nothing. They can issue them a written warning, or they can issue them an actual fine. And so we wanted to determine whether a person's perceived racial identity is associated with the level of punishment that they actually receive. And so, whoopsie. What I'm displaying here is a logistic regression model. And so the outcome, of course, is binary, either receiving a fine or not receiving a fine, and instead receiving a written warning. And what we find is that race in and of itself really isn't predictive of actually being fined for fare evasion. Instead, we end up with these sort of interactions between individual riders' sort of racial identity and the place by which they're encountered engaging in fare evasion. And so what we find is that Black riders are increasingly likely to be fined for fare evasion when they engage in that crime at stations located in predominantly white spaces. And so this interaction effect tells us that for Black riders, for every 1 standard deviation increase in the proportion of white residents surrounding a station, the odds of actually receiving a fine as opposed to a warning increased by 82%, right? Just as well, Black riders are much more likely to receive a fine as opposed to a written warning at stations that have high levels of ridership, right? So maybe Metro Center, Gallery Place, Chinatown, and so on and so forth. And the question becomes, well, why is this the case? Well, there's a host of research that suggests that racial incongruity, if you will, is very much predictive of the levels of punishment that a person may receive. In other words, it could be that Black riders are receiving more stringent penalties for engaging in crime and disorder offenses in predominantly white spaces. Right? Just as well, we know that there's a host of research that suggests that a person is much more likely to have criminal justice contact, i.e. contact with a police officer, when they are in spaces that do not encounter their own racial and ethnic background. And we suspect that this is what is actually going on here. And so, as of recent, I've become more interested in how attributes of communities actually impact public health outcomes. And so this particular study was conducted with a graduate student of mine. And we wanted to understand whether, attributes of Philadelphia neighborhoods are predictive of drug overdose mortality, right? And we had a number of key predictors, but I just want to quickly sort of summarize the important findings. One of those was that environmental conditions were very much predictive of overdose mortality. So in other words, neighborhoods that concentrated vacant buildings and vacant lots and dilapidated buildings were much more likely to have a higher concentration of fatal drug overdoses. Just as well, in linking the studies of criminology and public health, we found that drug arrest rates were positively associated with overdose mortality, right? And I think this finding really underscores the notion that we can't really police ourselves out of public health matters, right? And we might think about theoretically, why might this be the case? Well, many cities actually have Good Samaritan laws, whereby if you encounter a person that has experienced a drug overdose, you can actually call the police and theoretically you won't be prosecuted. We know that in practice that it doesn't work as well. It's very possible that if you encounter someone that's having a drug overdose, that you may have engaged in drug use with them. And that very much often probably dissuades individuals from calling the police when they witness someone actually having an overdose. But once again, I think this very much stresses the importance of structural attributes and furthering our understanding of health disparities across places. And so in continuing this thread of research, I recently began sort of studying how community structure influences COVID-19 mortality. And that's pretty much the focus of what I want to talk to you about today. As of Sunday, 6,000 individuals have died of COVID-19 related deaths in the city of Chicago. 41% of the deceased were Black, 79% were aged 60 and over. Just FYI, Black residents account for, I think, 30% of Chicago's population. White residents, on the other hand, account for 50% of Chicago's population, but only 22% of COVID-related deaths, right? And so this led me to wonder, what structural community attributes account for these divergent findings, particularly across different sections of the city. So I'm displaying for you maps of Chicago broken down by zip codes. And I want to focus in on the one that is top center at the moment, titled COVID-19 mortality. And so this map shows us deaths per 10,000 population, whereby lighter shadings are indicative of lower death rates for COVID-19, and the darker shadings are indicative of higher death rates for COVID-19. And so Chicago sort of loop and downtown area is located about here. O'Hare Airport is located somewhere out here. And we have the north side, the west side, and the south sides of Chicago. And so what we're seeing based on this map is that death rates tend to be highest in the south side section of the city, as well as the west. And we do see some sort of pockets of mortality in the northern section of the city as well. But I think it's really important to sort of compare across maps, because that's when we really understand the connections among these variables. The map on the lower left is that of racial composition by zip code, and it's giving us the proportion of residents that are Black or African American within these zip codes. And so what we see here is a racial and ethnic breakdown of Chicago, whereby the predominantly Black populations are concentrated in the western section of the city, as well as the south side as well. Now, if we compare these two maps, we can see some patterns here, right? Simply being that predominantly Black neighborhoods seem to have some of the highest rates of COVID-19 mortality across the city of Chicago. The map in the lower right-hand corner, however, gives us that of age composition, right? And so this measure reflects the proportion of residents that are aged 65 and over. And once again, we see that the sort of highest concentrations of elderly individuals are concentrated in the southern section of the city. And we also see some pockets to the north as well, right? So once again, I'm trying to understand how these structural attributes might account for variation in COVID mortality across zip codes. And so here's my research question just summed up. Are higher rates of COVID-19 mortality in Black neighborhoods due to a moderated impact of race on age structure, right? So I think we can see COVID-19 as a natural disaster. It took place largely out of our control, and it's resulted in significant suffering. And so to make sense of that and the sort of racial and age composition disparities, I wanted to turn to some other disasters in recent history. The first is that of Hurricane Katrina. It took place in 2005. And so I'm showing you a picture of New Orleans shortly after the hurricane hit. Katrina was the most expensive hurricane in American history, resulting in $170 billion in damage. Just as well, the storm left sections of New Orleans under 20 feet of water. But for the purposes of this talk, I'm really concerned about the sort of racial and age composition distribution of death. Now, I will admit that this may be a relatively conservative estimate of death as a result of Hurricane Katrina. There are some estimates that are much larger, but once again, I'm interested in the racial and age composition breakdowns. So as a result of the storm, almost 1,000 people died. Roughly half were Black or African American, 63% were elderly. We focus in on New Orleans in particular. We see that almost 700 individuals died. Almost 70% were Black and African American, and about 40% were both Black and elderly. So what we're seeing here is this connection once again between race and age structure, whereby Black and elderly individuals are much more likely to die as a result of experiencing a natural disaster. The other example that I want to highlight is that of the Chicago heat wave that took place in 1995. And so I am displaying a graph of daily temperatures in July from July 10th through the 19th. The y-axis, of course, indicates that of daily temperatures. So during this time period on July 13th, Chicago hit a high temperature of 104 degrees. Now, we might say that, well, it's summertime and it makes sense that, well, it gets hot in the summertime. So, what exactly is the big deal here? Well, unfortunately, the heat became relatively consequential for a lot of people. And so over a 7-day period, 739 individuals died as a result of heat-related illnesses. 72% of those individuals were elderly, and roughly half were Black and African American. And so the question is, well, how do we make sense of these findings? And so I turn to Klingenberg's work on denaturalizing disaster, And so he argued that we need to think differently about how we see disasters, right? So instead of seeing these as like these random happenstance events, we need to think about how institutions and governments actually respond to these events, right? And so in doing so, we'll have a better way of understanding how inequality is important for producing these divergent outcomes. One of the major points that he makes is that communities that were vulnerable socially and economically before a disaster took place, of course, will be extremely vulnerable when a disaster actually does take place. And so if we focus in on Chicago, one of the things that we know is that predominantly Black and African American neighborhoods are among the most segregated, the most disadvantaged, and the most resource poor, if you will. And so because of this, in the event that a disaster takes place, it would make sense that those communities would probably be the most dependent upon the local government to sort of deal with these emergencies. But instead, what we encountered was a number of institutional failures, if you will. And so Chicago hit a high temperature of 104 degrees on July 15th, but the city didn't issue a heat emergency until 2 days later. By then, the city's morgue had already began to be overwhelmed with bodies, unfortunately. And so because of the absence of, or because of rather policy inaction, there were no cooling shelters. There was no plan in place to transport elderly persons to cooling shelters. And there were no efforts to provide these individuals with AC units. And so within this context, we're able to stop thinking about, a heat wave as an unfortunate event, and more so able to think about it through the lenses of, the institutional policies and practices that actually did or did not take place that ended up being predictive of mortality. And so another theoretical construct that I think is relevant is that of the weathering hypothesis. And so Geronimus argued that Black Americans occupy a uniquely marginalized position in American society. They encounter racism and discrimination on a pretty regular basis. But those encounters have physiological consequences, such that it's possible that African Americans have a biological age that is beyond that of their chronological age. In other words, these experiences with racism and discrimination lead to what she calls accelerated aging. And so studies have lent support to this. One of her studies found that when comparing Black to white Americans, poverty very much accounts for these sort of divergent patterns in terms of biological aging, whereby Blacks are biologically older than that of white Americans. Additional studies have looked at this through the lenses of discrimination and also living in structurally disadvantaged neighborhoods, finding that both for Black Americans accounted for these accelerated aging impacts. And another study found that when focusing just on women, Black women are biologically about 8 years older than that of white women due to the experiences that they have with discrimination and racism. And so I'm sort of trying to pull together these theoretical constructs to sort of better understand COVID-19 mortality, particularly in Chicago, right? And so we have this denaturalizing disaster framework, and I like to refer to this as like institutional failure. And I think it's relatively easy to understand how that framework might be predictive of mortality, right? So we have examples such as the sort of rejection of mask mandates and the reluctance of mandating vaccinations, not necessarily in Chicago, but across many governments in the United States. On the weathering side, however, I think this suggests that Black persons have a greater risk of death due to a number of pre-existing conditions that may sort of biologically age their bodies anyway, right? So individually, both of these measures are predictive of COVID-19 mortality based on their theoretical constructs. But I think another way of looking at this is through like a mediating kind of model, right? And here what I'm arguing is that, you know, institutional failure, if you will, results in increased COVID-19 mortality by failing to protect the most vulnerable populations, right? So in this case, we're talking about sort of Black individuals and elderly Black individuals in particular. I just want to sort of clarify that I do not have all the appropriate measures to sort of test appropriately either one of these models, right? So I don't have exact measures of weathering, nor do I have exact measures of institutional failure or denaturalizing disaster. But I do believe that this framework gives me a way of sort of understanding the results that I'll show you relatively soon. Right? And so once again, I wanted to understand this relationship or the relationships between mortality and age structure and race. And so to do that, I derived data from the Chicago Department of Public Health. And in particular, my outcome of interest is that of weekly counts of COVID-19 related deaths over a 74-week period. So my data span from March 2020 through July of 2021. Also from the Department of Public Health, I was able to derive the proportion of COVID-19 tests that yielded positive results, the proportion of the population as well that has completed the vaccination series. Of course, this refers to the one-shot Johnson & Johnson vaccine or the two-shot series of Moderna and Pfizer, as well as the preventable hospitalization rate. So this refers to discharges from hospitals to treat diabetes, asthma, pulmonary disease, hypertension, heart failure, and pneumonia, conditions that are very much associated with COVID-19 mortality. I captured demographics by extracting data from the American Community Survey. And so I created an index of structural disadvantage that hung together relatively well, that includes the predictors that are shown here on the screen. Suffice to say, I wanted to sort of understand the extent to which zip codes across Chicago are more or less resource poor, if you will. I measured age by including an indicator of the proportion of residents that are aged 65 and over. And I included a series of dummy variables to capture racial and ethnic composition. So predominantly Black and predominantly Hispanic neighborhoods are those in which Black residents or Hispanic residents represent at least 70% of the population. Minority residents are those in which Black and Hispanic residents make up to 70% of the population, but neither group represents exclusively 70% of the population. And integrated groups or neighborhoods rather represent all other neighborhoods. I included predominantly white neighborhoods in the reference category of my inferential models. And so I really just want to clarify my unit of analysis here. The unit of analysis under study is that of zip code weeks. So in other words, for every zip code, I have 74 measurements on mortality as well as 74 measurements on the other public health indicators. Just as well, research has indicated, particularly in ecological studies, that it's important to control for spatial adjacency effects. And so what I'm showing you here is a map of Chicago organized by zip codes. And in this particular study, I wanted to count for the sort of diffusion of mortality rates. And so I did that by more or less calculating the average mortality rate for each zip code's neighboring zip codes, if you will. And I entered that in all inferential models as well. So here I'm displaying a table of my results. I conducted a series of negative binomial panel models to account for the distribution of the outcome, which is death counts attributed to COVID-19, right? Instead of coefficients, I'm displaying incidence rate ratios, which indicate the factor by which we can expect average weekly death counts to increase based on a 1 unit increase in any of the given predictors that are shown on the screen. I ran a bunch of models, but I just want to sort of highlight 4 today. And in particular, let's start with the first one. So the spatial lag effect tells us for every 1 standard deviation increase in the rate of mortality for each zip code's surrounding zip codes, we can expect mortality to increase by about 47%. Right? Our positivity indicator tells us that as positivity rates increase, of course, we can also expect mortality to increase as well. One of our key indicators is that of the proportion of elderly residents within a given zip code. And what this tells us is that on average, for every 1 standard deviation increase in the proportion of elderly residents, we can expect mortality to increase as well by about 20%. Preventable hospitalizations, which captures many of those conditions that are associated with mortality, are in this case indeed associated with increased mortality. I think the silver lining here, of course, is that of completed vaccination, right? So, excuse me, as the proportion of vaccinations within a given zip code increases, we can expect mortality to increase by about 7%. In model 2, I add in the impact of structural disadvantage, but I'm removing the effect of preventable hospitalizations because they are highly correlated. And what we see here is that each standard deviation increase in a zip code structural disadvantage score is associated with an 18% increase in mortality. And once again, I think that is very much in line with existing public health literature and existing studies on COVID-19 as well at the ecological level. In the next model, I attempt to account for racial composition, right? And here I'm entering in a number of dummy variables that are indicative of that. What this first effect tells us that it's labeled Black is that Black neighborhoods have mortality rates that are about 49% higher than that of predominantly white neighborhoods, controlling for other impacts that are in the model. We also see that there are other positive impacts as well for neighborhoods that are categorized as minority and integrated. In the final model is where I want to highlight our key interaction measure, right? That being of racial composition and age composition. Right? And so what we see here is a positive impact for this particular interaction, right? In other words, for predominantly Black neighborhoods, every 1 standard deviation increase in the proportion of residents aged 65 and over is associated with a 37% increase in mortality. In other words, we have a situation whereby a neighborhood's predominantly Black status is amplifying the effect of aging on mortality, right? Of course, we know that age is associated with COVID-19 mortality, but in this case, racial composition is actually amplifying that effect. And I think that's pretty noteworthy. I've also included an interaction between the positivity rate and structural disadvantage. And so I think what the story that this basically tells us is that as a zip code's exposure to COVID-19 increases, the impact of structural disadvantage actually decreases. And I think that theoretically makes sense, right? So if exposure increases, the impact of structural conditions might become slightly less important, but still significantly important as well. But I want to focus in on this sort of race and age composition interaction a little bit more. And so what I did was that I created a plot of predictive margins. And so this essentially highlights the interaction of race and age structure on mortality. So the x-axis indicates the proportion of residents that are age 65 and over. The y-axis displays the estimated COVID-19 death count. The blue line, however, indicates the estimated COVID-19 death count for predominantly white neighborhoods based on model 4. And the red neighborhood does the same, but for predominantly Black neighborhoods. So if we focus on the blue line, what we see is a relatively slight but positive impact of age structure on COVID-19 mortality, right? But when we compare that to the red line, we see something different. For predominantly Black neighborhoods, we see this curvilinear impact of age structure on mortality, whereby the impact of age structure has a stronger effect in predominantly Black versus predominantly white communities. And I think that's particularly noteworthy, right? Very much in line with what we see based on the weathering hypothesis, but also based on the sort of denaturalizing disaster perspective. Now, I think this is a really significant finding, and so I wanted to sort of gauge the robustness of it. And so what I did was that I substituted the proportion of residents age 65 and over with the proportion of residents age 75 and over. And here's the predictive margins plot of that as well. So we see pretty much the similar trend, whereby predominantly white neighborhoods have a relatively slight impact of age structural mortality, but for predominantly Black neighborhoods, that impact is very much accelerated once again. Right? And so what are the limitations of this work? I like to think highly of my work, but I know that it definitely isn't perfect. And so I of course, welcome your feedback. Actually, whoopsie. One second, hit the wrong button. I'm gonna blame it on aging. Okay. What are the limitations of this work? All right, so the first is that of the modifiable area of unit problem. And in other words, what this means is that my unit of analysis is that of zip codes. If I had shifted my unit of analysis to that of maybe census tracts or block groups, the findings may shift as well. And I think the ecological fallacy tells us that we can't assume that our findings at one level of analysis would translate to other units of analysis as well. Just as well, my time unit was that of weeks. If I had shifted to say months or quarters, the findings might shift as well. And I think it's important to be transparent about that. I must admit that the measure of preventable hospitalizations is likely an undercount because it excludes preventable hospitalizations that took place at Veterans Affairs hospitals in Chicago. We know that they do exist. Just as well, I am not controlling for any kind of public health policy initiatives in my models that could have impacted the results that I have uncovered here. In spite of that, I do think that there are some policy implications. The first of which is that I think we can use GIS or geographic information systems and sciences to sort of better understand where to target resources, right? And I think these tools help us really better understand the spatial context of inequality. Many studies on COVID-19 have more or less highlighted that, of course, Black individuals and older individuals have this higher risk of mortality. And I do think that that finding in and of itself is important, but it's also important to think about space as well as we think about race, because we know that in racialized societies, that people of different racial and ethnic groups often do not live together. And we also know that in American urban society, that race is often used as a variable that determines the allocations of critical resources that have implications for things like mortality and public health. Also, in light of vaccinations, I think it's important that we think about the structural barriers that persist for Black and elderly communities in terms of getting those folks actually vaccinated. Criminological research suggests that we really should be cognizant of the fear of crime. And so work by scholars such as Peterson and Crivo have more or less said that predominantly Black communities that have high levels of structural disadvantage also have high levels of crime, right? And so, we might want to think about the ways by which living in a high crime distressed community might impact the sort of willingness to sort of venture outside of that space to sort of seek public health resources. Just as well, I think it's important to think about the ways in which social isolation might impact vaccination, right? So we know that elderly individuals are among the most socially isolated in society, right? They're probably less likely also to sort of tap into more contemporary measures of communication. And so, based on these findings, I think it's important to think of, different and sort of innovative ways of targeting those populations. Just as well, I don't think that we can have a discussion about COVID-19 mortality and race without also, thinking about distrust in social institutions. We know from medical sociologists that Black Americans have good reason to not trust social institutions, particularly that of medicine. And so when we're having discussions about COVID-19 and vaccinations and mortality, it's also important to sort of think about the ways by which distrust structures those outcomes. And last but not least, it's also important to think about disability and access, right? So there's a lot of narratives out there that talk about, okay, how can we get more vaccinations? But there are fewer narratives that talk about how can we get vaccinations to people, right? So if we're talking about elderly populations and elderly isolated populations, it's important to think about, okay, can we get vaccinations to people as opposed to expecting people to, particularly marginalized folks, to sort of commute to sites, to medical sites to actually acquire these vaccinations, right? And that becomes increasingly important when we're talking about elderly disenfranchised populations. So all that being said, I want to like switch gears a little bit. As a scholar, I do believe that research and teaching go hand in hand, and I like to incorporate my research in my teaching as well. And I think one of the things that I've been sort of proud of is my ability to help students pose and answer questions that have real public policy implications. So I've taught a number of courses throughout my academic career. They're listed on the screen. The G's are indicative of courses that I've taught at the graduate level. U is indicative of undergraduate as well. I won't talk about all of these courses, but I just want to highlight two in particular. Very recently, I taught a course titled Pro-Seminar in Justice, and suffice to say that this is essentially a criminal justice policy course. And so in this class, I wanted to sort of ask a number of questions that all revolved around one central question. And that is, how does criminal justice policy sort of shape the decisions of criminal justice actors as well as consumers of the criminal justice system? And so, we ask questions like, when a person files a report against the police, does their race structure the likelihood of that report being taken seriously, right? Just as well, the Sentencing Reform Act essentially shifted discretion from judges to that of prosecutors, right? And so considering that prosecutors have had this newfound power for a while, how have they been able to use this prosecutorial power to sort of coerce individuals away from seeking actual trials and accepting plea bargains? And last but not least, we also thought about, how the sort of contraction of the American welfare state has been associated with or facilitated the expansion of the criminal justice complex. Just as well, I recently taught a course on geographic information systems and crime mapping. And so this course was geared towards graduate students, and I wanted to sort of provide them with GIS as a tool by which to answer relevant criminological and criminal justice questions. I do believe in written assignments such as final papers, but in this case, the final assignment was to produce a research poster and to present the results of that poster at a poster session that's very similar to that of a conference, if you will. And so I just want to highlight the work of one of my students in particular. He was interested in examining the impact of residency restrictions on sex offenders. Now, DC has no law that restricts the residential locations of registered sex offenders, but he wanted to understand what would happen in the event that DC did create such a law. And so on the map on the left, what we're displaying here, or what he's displayed, is the locations of school zones with 1,000-foot buffers, right? So each red circle indicates a 1,000-foot buffer around a given educational center. The black dots indicate the locations or the residences of registered sex offenders. And so he was able to use GIS to understand that if DC created a residency restriction law, that about 84% or 1,200 convicted sex offenders might be required to relocate rather, as a result, right? So once again, right, I think he's taken this tool and he's used it to answer a very relevant and important public policy question. As it pertains to service, I'm engaged in a number of projects, currently serving as a guest co-editor for the Journal of Contemporary Criminal Justice, and that's the November 2022 issue. And that issue will focus on issues relative to formal social control across urban space. I'm also currently working with the ACLU of DC, and what I'm doing there is trying to sort of understand the ways by which gentrification might shape the reasons why residents actually call the police, right? So in other words, has these demographic shifts led to a change in why people actually seek the police for services, as well as 311 as well. And last but not least, I have worked with the ACLU of Illinois and the city of Chicago to conduct statistical analyses of their investigatory stops or stops and frisk. So in that particular assignment, my job was to determine the extent to which race predicted the likelihood of a person experiencing an unconstitutional stop. Now, I do not have a legal background, so what myself and a colleague did was that we extracted a random sample of these narratives of police investigatory stops, and we redacted the racial identifiers of those stops, and we handed those stops to a legal team that then reviewed the remarks and then determined whether they were constitutional or unconstitutional. We then were able to conduct sort of descriptive statistics to figure out the extent to which race was associated with the likelihood of experiencing an unconstitutional stop. Overall, we found that these unconstitutional stops are rare in nature, but in particular, Black individuals were much more likely to experience an unconstitutional stop than their white counterparts. Right? And so, all that being said, I will stop for now and take any questions that you have.
Terrific. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Oh my gosh, that was so fascinating.
Thank you.
All that you described, I want to take your class and I can't wait to hear about that research too. It's all so interesting and timely. Okay, I'll moderate the questions, comments. Who would like to jump in first? Feel free to raise your hand, unmute yourself. Okay, Claire Dunning.
Hi, thanks so much for this presentation, Dr. Johnson.
Thank you.
My question comes from a question that I grapple with a lot, and I would love to hear your insight on it. So I am also an urbanist. I'm an urban historian by training, and the difference between community and neighborhood, right? We use the terms interchangeably and synonymously. I heard both of them come up in your talk, but I think of them as different, right? They aren't entirely the same. So I'd love to hear how both community and neighborhood show up in your work, and is there a difference there? What does that mean when you're doing this research on people, how they're spatially located, but also interacting in social communities? That's more, it's not really phrased as a question, but more of an invitation, as I would love to hear your thoughts.
Wow, that's a really interesting question. I think, I guess how I see community versus neighborhood is very much structured by, my disciplinary training, right? So for, criminologists and urban studies folks, we often see these as like interchangeable terms. But based on your question, I think that there is room to sort of see them as related but distinct concepts, right? So a person may speak of community through the lenses of, who is their circle, right? Or what does their circle look like, right? So what folks or what kinds of folks or what groups give me a sense of belonging, if you will, right? Neighborhood, if you will, may be a term that's more appropriate for actually delineating spaces, right? Spaces that share commonalities culturally and socially and economically. I'll admit that I use them interchangeably, but I think that your question actually sparks a lot of thinking in terms of whether I should use them interchangeably. But yeah, I don't think that as a field, criminology and urban studies have really sort of unpacked, right, what one term could or should mean versus the other.
Interesting, thank you. Yeah, because I think about it from a policy perspective, right? If we see that there's slight nuance differences, right? There's different sort of entry points about, do you target someone's neighborhood versus community? So thank you, that was wonderful.
Thank you.
Great, Peter Reuter, you're next.
So, Lallen, I should introduce myself as the one member of this school who's also in the criminology department at Maryland, so particularly interested in your work. I'm curious, you have your students look at the policy implications. Do you get them to draw policy recommendations, or is it just analytic implications?
Well, I think it depends, right? Particularly for my doctoral students and my graduate students, it's important to actually draw the policy implications as well. So for example, in In the Pro-Seminar of Justice course, which is essentially a criminal justice policy course, not only do we read texts and we critique them, but it's important to sort of understand, okay, what are the implications of these policies, right? And where did the policy failure actually take place, right? So if we had an opportunity to sort of redo this, what might we do? For example, we had a number of discussions about monetary sanctions, right? And so people often assume that if you go through the typical court process and you're prosecuted, that you may serve your time and that you're free to go, but that's really not true, right? Defendants are often saddled with monetary sanctions that last for the duration of their life after they're released from prison. And some of these things are ridiculous in terms of like court processing fees, paperwork fees, ankle monitoring fees that really sort of increase their debt. And so the question in that particular lecture became, well, what exactly should be done, right? And in particular, is it possible that, monetary sanctions actually fulfills the goals of punishment, right? Whatever those goals may be. And so we had a long discussion about, well, what we actually should be doing and what are the consequences of what we're doing right now. But before, we sort of jump to another person, I got to say that it's nice to actually meet you. I actually based my dissertation on one of your theories of drug markets a long time ago. I never thought that we would actually have some kind of interaction, but I appreciate actually meeting you virtually.
Thank you. Thanks for the answer.
Thanks so much. Rob Sprinkle.
Yeah, thanks for your talk. It's very difficult research to do, even now as we drink from the fire hose of COVID-19 data. It's surprising to note that there are lots of questions about those data that we can't answer. There are ways the data could have been collected, could be reported, that we don't see. We don't know how many people have been hospitalized. We don't know what the total number of hospital days has been. I mean, it's really scandalous, frankly. So that's hard to do. The weathering business, which is business, I shouldn't say business, pardon me, that's not at all what I meant. The weathering theory actually does, have some support. I mean, historically, like the enormously high death rates in the West Indies sugar plantation trade, for instance. And, there are ways to think about that that do make sense, stress hormones and the like. So it would be difficult to exclude that as a factor. I wonder if you might think about your data in an additional way. When considering infection rates in Black communities, it's not surprising that they would be high. There would be a lot of congregate living, and there would be many essential workers who could not avoid exposure. And they would be trying to take care of their aging parents who were living in crowded circumstances. So high infection rates, no surprise. And we know that vaccine uptake has been slower among African Americans for Tuskegee reasons and all sorts of understandable reasons. All that said, though, maybe what you're really trying to look at is the death rate compared to the infection rate. And that you may be able to find those data, and you may be able then to calculate the likelihood of death given infection. And in that way, you can sort of, if you pardon the amateurish quantitative comment, regress out some of these other factors and get a cleaner approach to the weathering phenomenon.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think a lot of what you said sort of reminded me of, in particular, sort of the African American family structure, right? So the likelihood of, having an intergenerational family structure within a given household, right? So whereby you have an older member that possibly is in the home, but you also have younger members that are more engaged with society and much more likely to be exposed to COVID-19. In the meanwhile, you have a person that is probably more so isolated, remains in the home a little bit more, has less exposure, but they end up possibly contracting COVID-19 because of their family members that are much more sort of integrated into mainstream society. So yeah, that I think that is something to definitely sort of keep in mind as I move forward with this. Yeah.
Thank you. Catherine Morsnap, you're next.
Hello, thank you so much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. Kind of building on going back to your research on COVID, I was interested in hearing a little bit more about how you might kind of connect some of your other work and the mechanisms you've uncovered in your other work to explain these findings. I know you're focused on the role of neighborhoods, but it also seems like, some of your findings about social control could be operating in your COVID findings. I haven't fully formed that thought, but I just kind of was curious about your thoughts on that, and would love to hear about some of the potential mechanisms that you think are driving those outcomes for COVID.
Yeah, that's a really good point. As a criminologist and someone that's trained in social science, I often see, things like structural disadvantage as one of the critical indicators of a number of outcomes, whether it be sort of crime, styles of policing, and also matters of public health as well. I feel like you're asking me to sort of draw the connection between these two sort of divergent but related branches, if you will. And I think that it's difficult to sort of unpack the sort of predominantly Black neighborhood experience without thinking about the justice system and exposure to violence, right? So social structure, social control, violence, and public health matters are all very much interconnected, right? In terms of exposure to violence, whether it be violence from other residents of the community, visitors, or even the police, if you will. As it pertains to this study, what I can possibly envision is that there's something about living in a neighborhood that is not only socially and economically disenfranchised, but often a neighborhood that is very likely characterized by extreme rates of violence that is going to structure your routine activities, right? There are tons of public health studies that suggest that if you live in neighborhoods that have high levels of violence, that you're less likely to actually engage in exercise, if you will, right? So we know that violence actually conditions a number of related health outcomes, particularly at the neighborhood level. I haven't controlled for that in this particular study, but I do believe that, that could very much be relevant, if you will. Just as well in some neighborhoods as individuals are fearful of violence, some residents are actually fearful just as well of the police, right? I don't know if that process is operating here. It was more so uncovered in the overdose mortality study that I conducted, but it's very possible that, that process is relevant in this situation as well. Yeah.
Yeah, it would also be interesting to connect some of your other work to, some research that's been done talking about care at hospitals and how Black people are treated when they go to hospitals, has contributed to increased death rates during COVID-19 as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's tons of research that suggests that, individuals that are socially and economically disenfranchised are, of course, distrustful of social institutions. And of course, they try to avoid them until they absolutely have to encounter them, right? I would suspect that that's very much related to, increased mortality rates, particularly in situations where we have populations that are, extremely distrustful of social institutions. Yeah.
Great. Dinor, you're next.
Dr. Johnson, thank you. This was fantastic. I think I'm going to join Professor Pearson in saying I want to take your GIS class because I think I think that looks fantastic. I'm curious how much you have tried to use the National Capital Region as your laboratory. I notice your studies on Chicago and Philadelphia. How much have you delved into this region? And clearly, data sets are available in this area, but I'm particularly intrigued by this possibility of really using this urban area as a laboratory for a lot of your analysis to kind of get to Peter Reuter's question to see if some of the policy interventions are making a difference or not. You mentioned potential policy interventions in your talk. I think a lot of our students are very experiential learning oriented and getting out into the community and doing that engagement, not just on the data and the GIS side, but on the policy interventions and are they working? Have you explored that at all?
Yes, actually I have. So for example, in my graduate GIS course, all students were required to use data that were based in DC. When I was a graduate student, there was no such thing as like Open Data DC or Open Data Philadelphia. You had to like cozy up to these institutions and beg them for data. Things have changed as of recent, fortunately, so it's sort of easier to do that. So in my teaching, I try to incorporate data sets that are relative to the DC metro region. Right now I'm teaching, oh my goodness, research methods actually this evening. And my students are also using data sets to analyze a number of questions. I think last week we analyzed marijuana arrests by race and ethnicity based here in DC. Some of my work has also used data based in DC. The research that I've conducted exploring the relationship between structural disadvantage and violence is very much based in Washington, DC. I published that maybe I think three or 4 years ago or so. So I'm very much interested in sort of exploring the data that's available here and establishing those relationships. Although I am a native Washingtonian, actually, before returning here, I was in Philadelphia for 10 years. And so much of my work was sort of based on, the relationships that I established there with folks. But I do see opportunities for this to happen actually more based on my relationship with the ACLU DC and the projects that, we'll be conducting moving forward. And I'm very much looking forward to that.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Terrific. I have Nathan Dietz next, and then I'll be sure and point out the question that arose in the chat too.
Yeah, no, thank you. I don't want that to get lost. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Johnson. This is really, really fascinating. And but actually, a couple of people have already taken some of the first two of the questions that I was hoping to ask. So I need to move on to question number 3 here. I'm just wondering what's been studied of when you talk about denaturalized disasters and the effect of institutions on disaster response in places like Chicago and New Orleans. I wonder what's been done on the after effects of that, as the cities begin to rebuild or recover from the damage that took place during those incidents, whether there were changes in institutions that maybe made them, allow them to be a little bit more responsive in future disasters, possibly. I know that in New Orleans, for instance, the 15th anniversary of Katrina was just a year or two ago, and a bunch of people from the local philanthropic sector got together and asked what they could do to carry on the recovery, especially in the 9th Ward. And they put together a regional association of grant makers to address, the ongoing recovery, as well as longstanding issues related to equity in certain parts of the city. And I just wonder, has anything been done in Chicago, for instance, to address that? And are there other good examples of situations where places have really responded positively to maybe a flat-footed response initially to a natural disaster?
Wow, that's a really good question. I feel like you're really sort of tapping into what's supposedly my interdisciplinary sort of skill here. So this paper has been sent out for review once, and I got comments back, and based on those comments, I actually incorporated this notion of denaturalizing disaster. So credit, I guess, to reviewer one for bringing that up. But to answer your question, I think that there are examples. I think maybe the most classic one could be that possibly of 9/11, right? And so the creation of the Department of Homeland Security to foster better communication across multiple agencies. As it pertains to Chicago, based on my readings of the 95 heat wave, I do believe that there was another heat wave that took place a couple of weeks later, right? And in that particular incident, 105 people died instead of about 730. Now, that's obviously still way too many as a result of a random heat wave, but I think that it suggests that the city did learn some lessons, right? So the notion of coordinating between multiple agencies, the idea of issuing a heat emergency a lot faster, developing a plan by which to deal with heat emergencies, such as calling elderly residents and saying, hey, you should possibly, move towards a cooling center, check on your neighbors, and so on and so forth. A lot of that really didn't happen the first time around. And in fact, the mayor at that time went on local media and said, hey, well, you know what, Chicago residents are used to these extremes. It's no big deal. We're used to the cold. So a random, swing of hot weather isn't that big of a deal. Of course, it didn't play out that way, but I think in some situations, they really did sort of learn their lesson. As it pertains to New Orleans, I'm sort of less versed on that. I did come across an article that talked about how residents experienced the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, and how they have attempted to move on with their lives and actually rebuild. And a lot of respondents in that qualitative study reported that the storm actually aged them, right? That the policy responses really didn't help make things better. That working with FEMA was very much a challenge, if you will, and that they're a lot worse off. As it pertains to aging, though, what was interesting was that the eldest individuals in that particular study said that, you know what, I've been here all this time. This is just life, right? I'll ride it out. I'll be okay. But the folks that were in sort of the 40 to 50 range that were caring for elderly individuals were the ones that experienced the most strain, the most stress, and that also reported that the storm actually aged them as a result of trying to sort of put their lives back together. I wish I knew more about it. And I think it's definitely relevant to the policy implications of this study, but yeah, I think I'll continue to sort of look into that.
No, thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you. There's a great question in the chat, and unfortunately, Shauna had to leave, but we'll have it on camera. She has said she's someone who's worked with policymakers to apply some of this research, and she's just wondering how that has gone for you. If you've been able to work with actual policymakers or institutions and sort of apply your research.
In this particular study, no, because I mean, to be honest with you, I'm a little bit nervous about sort of releasing the results into the universe until it's actually completed the peer review process. I don't want to paint myself as a public health expert. And so for a while, I sort of feel like I was feeling around in the dark, to be perfectly transparent about conducting this work. And so, for that reason, I really appreciate the feedback that I'm getting here. But in other studies, definitely so. So in my work with Chicago, I was working directly with the ACLU and the city of Chicago. They had entered into an agreement whereby if the city decided to allow the ACLU to more or less monitor the sort of racial breakdown of its stops and frisk over time, that they would not essentially sue the city of Chicago. And so, my work didn't necessarily come with policy implications, but the analyses that I provided, of course, or I think, inform policy decisions moving forward during that time period. Yeah.
Thank you so much. We have a few more minutes if there's any more questions or comments out there. Great. Peter, you sure? You're still muted. There we go.
So you're trained as a criminologist, and you've now conducted a public health study in which the word crime just occasionally flashes across the screen. In terms of your future research plans, how much would crime figure in that?
That's a really good question. Yes, I am trained as a criminologist. I have a criminal justice PhD. I also have an urban planning master's degree, and I've never written a plan, unfortunately. But I guess that what's possibly unique about my training is that I actually didn't have any criminologist on my dissertation committee, right? So my chair was a geographer by training. The co-chair was a social psychologist. So I guess I wasn't allowed to really think within the discipline. That being said, though, when I do conduct criminological studies, I do like to think about attributes of social structure. I think that that will always be a part of my work. And even in my experience going forward, I am sort of thinking about the relationship between criminology, criminal justice, and other relevant social disciplines. So for example, I want to think about how sort of like experiencing the fear of crime or living in a violent neighborhood might be associated with accelerated aging, if you will, right? So a lot of the public health work talks about how, racial discrimination is associated with accelerated aging, but how is it that, being exposed to violent crime on a regular basis might lead to a stress response that's associated with accelerated aging? So I see criminology and criminal justice as a very relevant part of my work, but I think it's important that I begin to think about criminology in a more interdisciplinary kind of way.
Yeah, I just say, I think public health tends to neglect crime as a causal factor. It's so a little déclassé even by public health standards as a subject. And so there are lots of interesting questions in which crime's on the right-hand side and some health outcome is on the left-hand side. And there's lots of work to do on that.
Yeah, I'd agree.
Totally agree as well.